We're going to start here with Commissioner Brendan Carr, who was called the FCC 5G crusader for his work to create the policy to fast-track 5G rollout and to champion America's 5G workforce. Commissioner Carr, last month, the Biden administration released its national spectrum strategy, and perhaps you were less than enthused with this strategy. You had said there was something missing, and namely spectrum. I was hoping you might talk about that, about what you think was missing, and perhaps there's a deficit in these frequencies, as we've shared. How do we get out of this, and how do we get this spectrum that we need?
Yeah, thank you so much, Roz, for the introduction and the opportunity to be with you all today. Great to be with you. Also with obviously Undersecretary Krach, who did some fantastic work in government and now is picking back up on that in the private sector as well. So great to have a conversation with you all. I look forward to hearing his remarks on this. You know, look, spectrum, as we have heard, is in America's leadership in wireless is part and parcel of our geopolitical leadership. When we are freeing up spectrum, it puts a wind at the back of America in terms of where investment goes, as we talked about how standards get developed. And so the U.S. continuing to lead the world in wireless is really vital to so many of our other interests. And we've been there before. We've had that leadership before, and it's made a real difference. But right now, we are starting to cede America's leadership in wireless to China or just to a group of countries that don't necessarily hold our values. And I think you saw that recently. You know, we are really starting to fall behind other countries. Right now, we're about, on average, somewhere in the order of 300 megahertz or more behind other countries when it comes to the availability of licensed mid-band spectrum. With China in particular, it's almost 700 megahertz by some studies that we are behind. And so we were entering this moment when the Biden administration was releasing a national spectrum strategy, really needing to get into gear and catch up on that global deficit and actually make available megahertz of spectrum. And this is where I think the Biden administration's spectrum strategy fell quite short. You know, it doesn't free up and it doesn't commit to freeing up even a single megahertz of spectrum, even though we are so far behind at this moment. What the Biden administration does is they commit to studying about 2,800 megahertz of spectrum over the next 2 years. And to put that in perspective, again, during the Trump years at the FCC, the undersecretary was involved in helping to pave the way for this. You know, we freed up something like 6,000 megahertz of licensed spectrum in addition to thousands of megahertz of unlicensed spectrum. Again, compare that 6,000 actually freed up compared to just studying a fraction of that at 2,800. So we are behind and we need to catch up. But the good news is we've been here before. You know, back in 2016, 2017, we had zero mid-band spectrum in America at a point in time in which other countries had 300 megahertz or more. And we pursued something that we described at the FCC as the 5G fast plan that included accelerating spectrum. And we moved on 2.5 gigahertz, 3.5, 4.9, the L band, 5.9, the 6 gigahertz band, as well as, you know, we call the big kahuna, the C band. And none of those were easy fights. None of those were fights where either incumbent stakeholders or in many cases, federal stakeholders didn't feel like they had an equity that was at issue. And they raised those concerns with the White House, and our then Chairman Ajit Pai spent a lot of days in the White House working through these issues. And we did. We worked through them in a way that freed up all of those megahertz of spectrum for the private sector. But we've seen sort of a bit of a 180 in the most recent years. So there is a game plan. We know how to do this, but we got to get back to leading in wireless because, again, it all goes back to our geopolitical leadership in who's going to dominate when it comes to 5G and 6G.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. So Undersecretary Krach, want to turn to you. Thank you for being so patient. It's an honor to have you with us. Your life's work has focused on secure and trusted network technologies. You were the chairman and CEO of DocuSign, and then you went to the U.S. State Department and you led the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies. And now you're with the Krach Institute for Global Diplomacy. You have described this as a pivotal moment, and the U.S. were jockeying with China to build the future of technology for our growth and democracy, not authoritarianism. How does this U.S. spectrum deficit facilitate China's quest to dominate the 5G era and beyond?
Well, Roslyn, first of all, thank you so much for everything you do for the Krach Institute and inviting me to be on this panel. And Brendan, thank you so much for your diligent service. And Clete and Jim, really appreciate the work you guys have been doing. Spectrum is at the core of not just our economic competitiveness, but our national security. And it's not just merely a policy challenge. This is a reflection of our long-term strategic contest in terms of freedom versus authoritarian aggressors like the Chinese Communist Party. And it really even goes beyond that. It's a fundamental battle for the values that will shape the global future. Roz, as you pointed out, when I was running U.S. economic diplomacy, my mission there was to develop and operationalize a global economic security strategy to drive economic growth, maximize national security, and also combat authoritarian aggression. The big and urgent matter at the time, and something perhaps that gives us some hope on this issue, was it looked like Huawei was going to run the table. They had announced 91 5G deals back in February 2020. And that time we got the authorities, our team at the State Department, to do something about that. And that's when we put together that clean network. And we were able to gather 60 countries, 200 telcos, representing 2/3 of the world's global GDP, to do what H.R. McMaster said was the first government initiative to defeat China Inc. And in the process, really prove their biggest weakness is lack of trust. And that's really what it boils down to at the end of the day. So, one of the other big initiatives that was related to that in the tech world was also semiconductors. When we popped our head up in 2020 as we were doing the global economic security strategy, we saw there was not one semiconductor company that was going to build anything in the United States. And that's when, believe it or not, within a 2-week time period, we were able to onshore TSMC, largest onshoring in history. And that really, that allowed us to persuade the other semiconductor manufacturers to build here, and also provided the catalyst we needed to architect with Senator Young, Senator Schumer, the $280 billion Chips and Science Act. And so if you look at semiconductors as a foundational strategy, for example, for 5G and 6G, look at spectrum as the fundamental foundation for deploying those technologies. So my point here is this, is that we've got to put the same type of emphasis and urgency, because in high tech, the ultimate weapon is speed, behind spectrum allocation and spectrum alignment that we are doing in the chips area. And we can certainly do that. Our mission has continued at the Krach Institute with a congressionally mandated Global Tech Security Commission. We're leading that. The objective is to develop a global tech security strategy with 15 of our closest technological allies. And this is really, really a big, big issue, because I think it's been pointed out, 5G and 6G enables not just the productivity of the United States, but the development of all these technologies. And it's critical for our manufacturing base so that we are able to use the Internet of Things and robotics and automation and automatic guided vehicles and all these things, and create, totally integrated factories, those type of things. So this is right at the heart of the matter, and speed matters.
So let's picking up on what Undersecretary Krach described here as these important opportunities for industry and diplomacy. Commissioner Carr, when we talk about these forum, as you know, right now the World Radio Communications Conference is going on in Dubai, WRC 23. Can you help our audience understand the significance of this event and the implication of the U.S. falling behind in our failure to coordinate with our allies and the other nations about harmonizing the relevant spectrum and frequencies?
Yeah, well, first of all, Undersecretary made a lot of great points there. The Clean Networks Initiative that was launched was so important and is making so much progress. I think we need to take some of those same principles and put them into a clean standards type of approach as well to make sure these standards that are developing for 5G and 6G reflect common core values. Xi Jinping has described their efforts to control and dominate the standard setting process as part of what he calls the coming out policies for the CCP. So I think we need to be very watchful there. And right now, as we're speaking here in Dubai, as you noted in your question, there is a global conference going on called the World Radio Conference, or WORC. It happens every 4 or 5 years. And the idea is that is where leaders from around the world get together and they set the rules of the road in terms of what spectrum bands are going to be available for particular use cases. And this is an instance where the U.S., sort of for the first time in my memory, is going into this global conference playing defense. We've identified something like 300 megahertz of spectrum that we're interested in for 5G. Only 100 megahertz of that 300 would be new spectrum. In contrast, I think China is pushing 5 or 6 separate spectrum bands for 5G. And I'm not saying I agree with China as to all those spectrum bands that they have an eye on, but it just goes to show an imbalance where they're coming in with an affirmative agenda and the U.S. is stuck playing defense. And I think had the Biden administration been able to put out a real spectrum strategy ahead of this, meaning one that identified specific spectrum bands, specific number of megahertz within those bands, in years by which those spectrum bands would be made available, I think it would have put a better wind at the back of the U.S. negotiators heading into work. And look, again, I think we have an opportunity to turn things around, but we're just continuing not to head in a good direction. It was just last week, I believe, we were testifying in the House and Congress, and the FCC chair noted that we're likely to miss a statutory deadline for freeing up a particular spectrum band because the Commerce Department's NTIA isn't doing the work that we need them to do with the FCC for us to identify and clear a particular spectrum band. So, look, I think we're sort of hitting a spectrum stall speed in this country. We've got to find a way to turn things around here.
Undersecretary Krach, let's come back to you. I mean, this is really your bailiwick. You are the person who has been able to work with leaders of other nations. You work with the business community. You know how to get people on board to get things done. And you've done that in your business life and your government life. How do you assess the situation now? And what can we do? How do you see us coming together so that we can win on 6G? We can protect and promote American innovation.
Roz, this is where tech diplomacy really comes in. And if you look at this kind of category, we, in essence, some would say we invented that at the State Department. It's the practice of integrating technological expertise and high-tech business strategies with foreign policy tools. And here again, speed matters. And so if you look at what we're doing at the Krach Institute in terms of bridging between Silicon Valley and Washington, the mission is clear. It's to accelerate the innovation, deployment, and adoption of trusted technology. So, one of the big things, there's several big things that we're doing with the global tech security strategy with our 15 closest technological allies. We're advancing on several fronts. The first, so here's the five big things that we're implementing right now that came out of it. It's not just a strategy, it's also operationalizing it. The first is the Global Trusted Tech Network. And this is consists of nations, companies, leaders, committed to trusted technology. And this is a bulwark against technological authoritarianism. And it's built on the success of the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies that proved so effective before. So that's a big initiative. One of the other big initiatives is in the area of we're building a tech supply chain security center that, bolsters American tech manufacturing, leverages the know-how of the onshoring we did with the TSMC fab and architecting the Chips and Science Act, and integrated with what the White House just came out with in terms of supply chain security. And then the third thing is, and this has been brought up, is the Global Trusted Tech Standards and Certification Center. And we're engaging in that right now. As a matter of fact, one of the co-chairs for that will be the Minister of Digital Affairs, the amazing Audrey Tong from Taiwan. And that's to ensure that 6G and other emerging technologies are developed in a manner, that champions democracy. And this utilizes really the same principles and expertise that we use to put together the digital trust standard. And this is, based on trust principles, things like integrity, accountability, reciprocity, respect for rule of law, respect for property, respect for sovereignty, respect for the planet, respect for human rights. That's key. And then final two, there's the Trusted Tech Microfinance Partnership. And this is something that we formed with Opportunity International and leading high-tech companies to provide prepackaged AI-based solutions to low-income communities in the global South. This is a critical area where the U.S. is behind, and that's the global South. And this fills a huge need I saw firsthand while I was chairing the International Development Finance Corp to close the digital divide in rural areas. And then, the final one that we're about ready to launch in January is the Tech Diplomacy Academy. This provides a strategic curriculum that recognizes that in order to preserve freedom, it's an all of society effort is needed. And so the Academy has kind of emerged as a nexus of that effort in terms of cultivating a cadre of technologically adept private sector diplomats who can lead this charge. So this is, with the government and with our allies, this is all a society thing. So, like I said before, Spectrum is just so fundamental to that. So I really appreciate you guys banging the drums on this.
So, well, we're going to turn at this moment. We have some audience questions, and I'm going to tee this up for Jim and Clete, because it does refer back to something you said at the beginning of a sort of, this is not a zero-sum game. This is not a false dichotomy. There's a win-win here. But it sounds, so I think this is maybe a two-part question. The first part is we have this idea 5G needs to have exclusive license use. That's part of the design of the technology. It needs to have the dedicated spectrum in order to work. So if one party is using it, then another party can't. So maybe explain that. And I think the second part of this is, where do we go from here? Clearly, we can get maybe the business community on board, the American people are on board, but Congress isn't there. So perhaps, Jim, you might help us to understand what are the steps that have to happen here to go forward.
Sure, and Clete, you should chime in whenever you want. But the main thing is what we're doing, and I think Undersecretary Krach and Commissioner Carr have said this. What we're doing is different from the rest of what the rest of the world is doing, and that will hurt us in the market. It will hurt us in our defense capabilities. So we hope we can find solutions that will let the two of them work together. One of the solutions, I'll maybe, I don't know if Clete agrees with this, we haven't talked about it. For years now, we've been saying spectrum sharing, and it's sort of like a magical formula. It's not going to help us out in the near term. There are things we can do, sure, but we're going to have to make some hard decisions over how to transition defense systems to more modern applications, how to make sure they fit with what the rest of the world does, and how we can take advantage of it here in the U.S. I'll tell you right now, not a lot of agreement in these areas, but we hope we can build that agreement over the next few months.
Yeah, I'll just add, and this circles back to some of the points that Commissioner Carr and Undersecretary Krach made. it strikes me as somebody who is not is not spent years and years as a spectrum engineer. I'm a security person and kind of come into spectrum via security considerations. And it strikes me that a key problem we have at the policy level, certainly not with deeply well-informed policymakers like Commissioner Carr and Undersecretary Krach, but with the broader policymaking community, spectrum is literally this abstraction. It's invisible radio waves that are really hard to understand. How does this matter concretely in the real world, particularly in a defense and warfighting posture? So I think part of the challenge is Undersecretary mentioned the Chips and Science Act, which there aren't too many experts in chip fabrication in the policymaking world either. But we can at least understand that an overwhelming majority of the chips that the United States and our allies use come from one island that is threatened by the PRC. And so it's a concrete challenge that if the PRC were to attack or otherwise intervene in Taiwan, that would have a profound concrete effect on our commercial and other capabilities. So I think one thing that we're going to try to do in the coming weeks is to articulate concrete security risks that come from these abstract invisible radio waves. Why does it matter, as Commissioner Carr laid out? Why does it matter as a security question that we're so far behind? And so we're going to try to at least begin the process of making that concrete. And then it's what Jim was saying about sharing. And again, particularly in the lower 3 gigahertz band, but also in the future in 7 and 8, getting beyond studies. How do we make concrete? Is it repacking? Is it clearing? Is it static sharing? The so-called where the kind of experiment at play is dynamic sharing, where sort of this real-time sharing of spectrum that's not ready for prime time and may not be for a while. But what is ready for prime time is geographic sharing or frequency sharing. So sort of splitting frequencies for sharing purposes. And that's where we have to get engineers in the room with, as I think Commissioner Carr said it, with the imperative to come up with solutions. The imperative is to free up more spectrum. And then the question, the subsequent hard questions are, how do we do it? And it has to do with geographical locations, tuning capabilities, and a whole host of other highly technical things that we need engineers to dig into to figure out how can we free up a certain amount of spectrum in that lower 3 band in order to maximize our national security capabilities, both on the defense and weapon system side and also on the commercial innovation side.
Commissioner Carr, I want to turn to you because this is an area that at the FCC knows quite a lot about. I mean, we can talk about repacking spectrum, has gone through multiple instances where spectrum had been used by one set of purposes or one industry, then refarmed and then used in another. And I think remarkably, most recently in the C-band auction, there were an acceleration of this refarming. Similarly, in incentive auction, we know in the defense case that the relevant frequencies we're talking about, they're being used by the U.S. military abroad. They're aligned with those in those countries. They're aligned with those local, those particular setups and working fine, but not here in the USA. So do you have any thoughts here from FCC perspective as to making this transition? Could it work from a technical perspective? How long could it take? And anything else that can happen from your side on the federal side at the FCC to enable it? And of course, you're working with NTIA to do that.
Well, thanks. I mean, look, if you step back, the numbers I think are something like the federal government has something like 10 times the amount of mid-band spectrum as what we've made available for the private sector. So I think we have to do a better job of finding a balance there. I would like to hope we can find a path forward, for instance, on the lower 3 gigahertz band, as you noted. I do think that there can be a win-win when we ultimately get to a spot in which we've got more spectrum made available for the commercial sector. And we talked briefly earlier about the modes of licensing, and there's 3 main modes at the current moment. One is license, which is important to have the certainty needed to see massive levels of investment. We have sort of a lightly licensed approach, CBRS, that we're still sort of experimenting with and getting information on, and there's unlicensed. And we obviously have to have the right mix of all of that. But I'll just say, we did make available, 1,200 megahertz of unlicensed spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band. So I think in the near term, we really need more of a focus on licensed spectrum. And again, there was a study that showed that we rank 13th out of 15 leading markets around the world when it comes to availability of licensed midband. But the thing that's interesting to me is that, the private sector in this country continues to deliver, even though we are putting them at a competitive disadvantage globally when it comes to the availability of spectrum. I think the US right now has something like 54% of all connections are on 5G, whereas in China, that number is only 27%. So even though the amount of spectrum available for 5G is skewed towards other countries, the US private sector so far has been doing a really good job, but I don't know that we can stay on that track unless we catch up on that spectrum imbalance.
So let me put this forth to the panel. Anyone who wants to have some ideas around which bands we should prioritize for licensed commercial use, and is it realistic to sort of, how would we say, demand that the military applications modernize? We don't have so much insight, but we could suggest that it's maybe not the most efficient use of the particular bands that are there, given those numbers you cited. They're sitting on a lot of mid-band spectrum using limited number of applications versus the private industry is on a very small amount, but yet puts much more throughput, has much higher usage. So anybody on the panel would like to suggest a particular band that we should look at or a particular solution?
Roz, I don't have a particular band solution or getting into the technical details, but the comment I'd like to make, and by the way, we have plenty of people who know the answer to that, and it's really an optimization question. And if there's anything I learned, Roz, in government, it's just all this stuff is just common sense. And if I look back at what would a CEO do in this case? What a CEO would put together knowledgeable people, put them around a table. It's got to be a limited number you can fit in a room, an ordinary room, and make a decision. Because we're getting paralysis by analysis with this. And, that was one of the things we looked at when we saw the shape of the semiconductor business, or Huawei running around when we were building the clean network. At a certain point, you just have to get the input and make a decision. And we've got the brain and power to do that. So it's time to make it, because the clock is running and we're running out of time.
Clete, it looks like you have something to add.
No, I'm just in complete agreement with Undersecretary. This is hard. It's doable. We've done it before. We, the United States, federal government and industry, Commissioner Carr outlined a whole host of examples, even in recent years. And what happened, and it's not like any of those discussions were easy. It's hard, and it is, as I think Senator Young put it, this is a finite resource, these invisible radio waves, but it cannot be a zero-sum game. We, the United States, government and industry, must look at this, and the Undersecretary used the word optimization. This is an optimization challenge, and that's hard. But we have to make sure, because our interests are aligned. Nobody wants a future of autocratic domination of the world, neither DoD nor the wireless industry. We want a future of dynamism, innovation, freedom of expression, and prosperity. And to get that, we have to optimize the finite resources that exist. And that means, whether it's getting people into a room or having the president make decisions, we have to figure out what's the optimal use of this finite resource and look at it as optimization as opposed to fighting over a scarce resource.
So when we kicked off our call today, we had two leaders, one from the House and one from the Senate, saying that this had to be done. Does anyone want to suggest? Is Congress there yet? Are they ready to move forward on this? We can see that there are many people who recognize that we need to win in 5G. We've got to win in 6G. What else has to happen on the congressional front?
Well, I'll start, and others can chime in when they wish, but I'll start by saying I love antiques, right? And so therefore, when I look at the AWACS introduced in 1972, right? I love antiques, but we're thinking about modernization, and there's a pipeline for modernization with the E7 wedge tail. Japan and other countries are sort of ahead of us in the queue for modernizing their AWACS. These are radar-dependent systems. We can use the opportunity to modernize defense systems to make them more efficient. In 1972, it was broadcast, amateur radio, and what was it? Taxi cabs, mobile taxi cab radios. It wasn't a heck of a lot of use for beyond the government. That's changed completely. So let's use defense modernization as a way to go. It would help if we could be more transparent in where spectrum is actually used. And so a lot of these cases, people don't actually know. Are there still guard bands, which are left over from the 20th century? What's actually being used? Sometimes there's classified programs that people don't admit they're using, and you stumble on them in this. So we got to think about how to do transparency. Finally, as I think everyone has said, you need auction authority. You need to be able to pay for any changes that might come up. And the Spectrum Reallocation Fund can be modernized. The number of costs that can be covered under the SRF can be expanded. It was more limited when it was designed more than a decade ago. But those are three things we can do: modernize DoD, improve transparency, and restore auction authority. All of those require congressional action. And I think, as you said, many in Congress understand that. So I'm optimistic that perhaps we can make progress.
Excellent. Well, we only have a minute to go. I would like Undersecretary Krach, if you could wrap us up for our event today. What do you think about the next steps ahead?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank this group because all your voices really matter. And your expertise matters. And, I remember back in the prior administration being in the Situation Room debating these issues when, as Brendan said, we freed up an unprecedented amount of bandwidth. And there was an inflection point in one of those meetings. I obviously can't get into the details, but it actually was when a general stood up and said, look, we're not going to all get everything that we want. Let's just make a decision together because we're all united in terms of national security of the United States. And that was really a unifying moment. And so anyway, I really believe it boils down to that. And you need that kind of leadership. So we can do it. This is not hopeless. And the United States is, when they put their mind to something, it's pretty powerful. And the key thing is to get our agencies, our military, our private sector, and our allies all working together, because that's the only way that we're going to preserve our freedoms and our democracy. So thanks so much, Roz. I really appreciate everything you've done today.
Well, thank you to our audience for joining us. Thank you to our excellent panel, including Senator Todd Young, Congressman Bob Letta, Keith Krach from the Tech Diplomacy Institute at Purdue University, our excellent Commissioner Brendan Carr of the Federal Communications Commission, and very much to CSIS for hosting us today. You can find these reports at the website along with much more excellent content. We have been joined by our Senior Vice President at CSIS, Jim Lewis, and Senior Fellow Clete Johnson. Thank you all and look forward to see you next time.